Because so many children are at risk, and to demonstrate the disturbing reality of what goes on in some chat rooms, we enlisted the help of volunteers from a vigilante organization called Perverted Justice. Volunteers of this controversial group are experts at pretending to be children online in order to catch and expose potential predators.
First girl, her name is Michaela. She's 13 years old. We've been talking on Facebook for the last couple of days, and we're supposed to meet up at the park later when our parents leave the house.
What's wrong with you?
I'm sorry.
How can you do this?
Get up to catch up to him. Was that like the curb to the grass? I jump.
You understand? Never, ever, ever do this again.
Predator content. It's a little surreal to think that such a dark and tragic subject would be as popular as it is. It's hard to go online, let alone YouTube these days, and escape the endless amount of content exploiting the topic of monsters who prey on children. Whether it's the continued exploits of Chris Hansen trying to capitalize on the success of his past, re-uploads of the series that started it all, or drama YouTubers exploiting every bit of tea they can from the story, to say it's pervasive is a bit of an understatement. And that's without bringing up the litany of prank channels that rode the Predator Hunter train as far as they possibly could. It's easy to see just how oversaturated and exploitative the topic has become, in many cases losing sight of the purposes of education or bringing justice and light to the victims and monsters of this horrific phenomenon. And while many will probably blame the clout-centric nature of YouTube and the brain-rotting effect of TikTok for the sensationalization of this topic, turning predators into content essentially, the reality is that this three-act structure of education to entertainment to exploitation is not unique to the internet. You could trace it back to the origin of all of this, because the investigative NBC series, To Catch a Predator, went through this exact same cycle, starting with humble beginnings as an educational show, to becoming the edutainment powerhouse it's remembered for, to becoming a exploitative and sensational piece of media, to bringing about its own cancellation with just how badly it botched investigations in search for ratings, rather than just staying as a news program that sought after justice. Just like today, with how all this started with news reports and channels hunting predators like Anxiety War, to becoming the favorite topic of any commentary grifter looking to ape Turkey Tom's famous loser creeps pedos formula, and the plethora of Instagram fuckboys posting their totally not staged escapades to YouTube.
I'm gonna catch me a fucking pedophile.
So how about we take a bit more of an in-depth look and see just how all this played out. Why don't you take a seat over there and let's talk about To Catch a Predator. To Catch a Predator was a series that could realistically only come about once. Not because it's something that couldn't air today or anything like that, but simply because it was only what it was due to the converging alliances of key figures that made the show what it was. Obviously, the big one here is Chris Hansen. And while Chris might have a scuffed and overall negative reputation today due to his escapades in recent years, like the flagging campaign or the botching of the Onision investigation, the truth is, Chris really is someone who deserves his flowers in terms of his investigative journalism. I highly recommend Toad McKinley's documentary, as it can give you a much more clear and precise insight into just who he is and what he's done. But the Cliff Notes version is that Hansen had his humble beginnings as a news broadcaster with a lifelong passion for journalism, and with a mixture of his raw talent, drive to bring cutting news stories, and a willingness to take on stories that most others wouldn't bother to touch, he was able to rise as a star in his own right before TCAP even hit the ideas room. He had played a key role in exposing some of the interworkings of Detroit's crack epidemic during the 80s, doing an expose on the Chambers brothers. It was also these sorts of investigations that gave rise to his initial fame, also covering stories like Columbine, the Unabomber, and even Indian exploitation of child labor. So when it came time for TCAP to come to fruition, no other journalist would be a better choice than Hansen. The other key player in this would be the watchdog group Perverted Justice. PJ was a bit of a notorious group, as while they did do good work in exposing and outing predators, let's just say their tactics and exploits more closely resembled those of Kiwi Farms than the traditional justice system. And their more exploitative and trollish methods would give them a bit of a bad reputation. There's a reason why you saw Del Harvey and Frag on the show, rather than the founding members like Xavier Von Erich. And that's because those two were the most professional faces they had compared to some of the more ragtag members who volunteered. As you can see from the criticism section of just the Wikipedia page alone, it should put into perspective just how mixed people felt about this group. But much like Hansen, these were the necessary people to make TCAP what it was, though it wouldn't initially start out the way you might expect. We all remember To Catch a Predator as the series where Hansen would tell pedos to take a seat, give a hilarious interview, and let the cops swarm the criminals like a pack of hyenas on their way out of the house. But in reality, the first few investigations, while having a few interviews and funny moments, were almost completely educational, even being a little boring at times due to how dry they could be. But the point of the series wasn't to shock you and entertain those who wanted to see justice delivered in a bit of a comedic way. It was purely to educate you on the phenomena of the rising risk of online predators.
And now, Dangerous Web. Here is Stone Phillips.
Good evening. Don't talk to strangers. It's a basic rule of safety every parent tells their child.
The first investigation originally aired under the name Dangerous Web and had no actual police involvement. That wouldn't happen for a while, actually. The investigation would end up luring 18 men to the Sting House, though very few would actually end up having an interview, as the majority of them would opt to bolt and run at the first sign that this might not be what they thought it was. The three most important events of this episode were revealing a firefighter who had not only tried to meet up with a minor, but also exposed himself via webcam and discussed just what he wanted to do with the underage girl. The next would be this goofy fuck who tries to play semantics and coach his would-be victim on just what to say to make it seem like he had just a little more legal wiggle room, not realizing that this entire exchange was caught on camera.
Okay, listen, just say something to me.
What do you want me to say?
And say, Rachel, you're 19 years old, right?
I'm not, though. You know I'm not.
I don't know that.
I told you I was 14. You saw it, you said back to me. What are you talking
No.
about?
Not as far as I know. As far as I know, you're 19 years old, right?
But
Rachel, can you read between the lines?
And lastly, we have the infamous Dark Hero 73, a schizophrenic man who had only recently been released from a mental institution, as well as one of the few men that would actually give an interview to Chris. It would be a bit of a contentious interview, however, mostly due to the idea of this possibly being exploitation due to his mental illness. NBC opted to air it anyway, but with a facial blur, one of the only to ever appear in the show's run. The reason this is incredibly important is because compared to what happens towards the end of the series, this initial refrain and hesitance say a lot about the early motivations of the series. You won't find Chris's dad jokes here, and the more sensationalist angles are reserved in favor of boomerific fear-mongering of the internet. The entire production is done in a very educational and matter-of-fact way, showcasing that it's not just the mentally ill like Dark Hero who are capable of these things, but even those we consider heroes to the public, such as firefighters. This format would be continued with the subsequent investigations, and while a bit more entertainment value can be found in them, mostly due to the bizarre reality that they would get jobless freaks to enter the Sting House naked, only to catch them the very next day and utter famous phrases like,
I just came to get something to eat.
And I have very seldom been at a loss for words.
Sir, I just came to get something to eat.
But I don't even know what to ask you first.
The main focus did stay on educating the public and exposing these monsters for what they were, Unlike the content-focused stuff you see today, where staged videos showcasing what could only be described as the living embodiments of Pepe Le Pew are shot with paintball guns. The odd characters found in TCAP were often mentally ill or just strange people who inhabited the web, and the more impactful figures caught would be people of high authority or perceived virtue, like the rabbi caught in the Fairfax investigation.
What do you do for a living? A rabbi. That's right, a rabbi. The man who sent naked pictures of himself is a man of God.
This iteration of the show might not be as conducive to the iconic nature of the later investigations and just what TCAP is remembered for, but like I said before, it was the transparency and the motivations of NBC and the show's crew. And by no means am I trying to say you can't make an entertaining show out of things like this, not by a long shot. But the purposes of justice and education were the forefront as they should be. Ratings are important to any show, no matter how serious it may be, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to keep people captivated. It's not like this is a topic that's really all that easy to discuss, but focusing on bringing a light to the dark and disturbing phenomenon like this, rather than exploiting it for ratings and profits, well, it allowed for the show to appeal to just about anyone who caught it during these early episodes. Now, to compare this to something a bit more recent, the best way I can compare this to anything would actually be a channel called Anxiety War here on YouTube. Anxiety War is a content creator who essentially did the same thing PJ would do back in the day, posing as a miner online and spending weeks and sometimes longer catfishing and baiting these predators, collecting as much evidence as he could before conducting his own ambush interviews. And while most of the time the men he caught would bolt, he would at least get their faces on camera, and at times even confessions, to give to the police as evidence to get an official investigation rolling. Like these early TCAP episodes, Zach's delivery and editing would be pretty dry as well, and not waste too much time on attempting to bait the viewer with sensationalist elements. But as his notoriety would rise amongst the YouTube ranks, so would his copycats, and that's something we can talk about a little bit later. In terms of TCAP, this more dry, by the numbers, and just straightforward approach would take a bit of a backseat going forward. And while not instantly falling into the exploitation territory, the show would find a bit of a middle ground, and it's here where the golden age of To Catch a Predator would truly begin. When we get towards the center of the series, things really begin to shift. After the third investigation, Dateline would team up with local police departments in order to have those caught in the sting arrested directly after their interviews. This way they could prevent the escapades of predators like Walter Babst, who returned to his job as a teacher after his appearance, from ever having an ability to do that ever again. Coincidentally, along with this more direct approach to achieving judgment, came a lesser focus on staying dry and matter-of-fact. That's not to say it became pure entertainment just yet, but the editors and even Chris himself would be a bit more loose with their approach to presentation, letting the natural comedy of a situation become more apparent than previously shown. You could see this in the focus they give to odd fetishes.
What was your plan with the cat?
I don't know, I was just being stupid with that.
The cat? The whipped cream? You want the girl to have sex with a cat and use whipped cream? What? Explain that.
I was just being stupid with that. I wasn't really serious about that.
I can only imagine what would have been going on in this house had I not been here.
And Chris being more open to lobbing jokes and direct jabs at those he interviewed.
I don't know why you're asking me stuff like this. I mean...
Well, why do you think I'm curious about all this?
I could tell you're a therapist, I know. I mean, not just...
You think I'm a therapist?
Yeah, by the way you're...
Do you think that you came over here to meet this girl and magically a therapist sat down to help you through your problem?
And to say this made for good TV is an understatement. And this is the era the show is most famous for, with iconic episodes like Fort Myers, Florida, where we get to meet generic white male.
What? No way.
What kept the show so great was its willingness to shift and morph these investigations each time in an attempt to see just how widespread the problem was, moving from strictly conducting stings in large metropolitan areas to doing some in more rural and low-populated places, like the Ohio episode. What was amazing about this is that while, yes, we did get to hear the beautiful voice of Jeff Stacy,
you ask if she does anal.
It's a question.
We would also be gifted with more revealing predators that would drive hours and sometimes cross state lines just to have a chance to fulfill their twisted fantasies. It did a lot to show off the true face of this issue, and even in cases like Kevin Westerbeck, it would show the flaws in the justice system that allowed previous offenders to get out and start their cycle of violence all over again. The golden age of TCAP was one of the most important shows to ever be aired on TV. It walked a thin line between being pure entertainment and serving as educational material and, in many ways, trying to achieve some form of justice. And with the number of convictions that would come with every episode, and the overall notoriety and fear expressed by many of the predators due to the show, it made it pretty apparent that things were working. The public was becoming aware and taking better precautions, and justice was being served to just about everyone caught in the stings. And if we look at the lesser numbers of people showing up with the later episodes, it does show that many predators were less willing to take the risk. That's not to say that TCAP has miraculously stopped the issue of online grooming and child exploitation. I mean, this is obviously an issue we're still seeing play out today, but it did shine a light on it, and in many ways helped to dissuade many would-be predators due to the fear of being caught up in a sting, with fewer and fewer men being caught with each episode. But as with anything, all good things come to an end, and given the cycle I described at the beginning, the show's continued embrace of exploiting more sensationalist elements was really just the writing on the wall for how things were going to end.
Don't mess with Murphy.
The 9th investigation of To Catch a Predator may not have been its last, but it was definitely the most pivotal moment in the series' run. The entire episode is a dramatic departure of what came before. While it might not be as apparent if you watch the series chronologically, the editing and overall tone is set to be much more sensational than what has been done previously, and if you throw this on right after watching one of the first 3 investigations, you're gonna get whiplash because this whole thing feels like a reality show.
And just last week, Dateline set up an investigation in a new town, Murphy, Texas. What happened there was a shock to everyone.
He had a pistol in his hand.
Small caliber.
To say the Murphy sting went rough is an understatement. The police chief assisting with the investigation had stated he thought NBC would put Murphy on the map. The mere presence of NBC and the TCAP crew would end up eliciting a lot of backlash from Murphy's local community though, who would end up protesting outside the Sting House. And this wasn't some NAMBLA group either. Ultimately, these protests would be broken up by the Murphy police. And look, I do think the anger here was more than likely misplaced, but it did show that during this investigation, the police were giving far more favorable treatment and privilege to NBC and crew rather than listening to and trying to qualm the concerns of the people that they were meant to serve and protect. And as you'll see, this would ultimately lead to some of the fears of these protesters coming true. A more shock and awe-oriented approach to the show wasn't something that sounded terrible on paper, it was the influence of the camera and the hunt for ratings that saw things shift and turn into the disaster that would unfold. Anyone familiar with TCAP is probably well aware of the story of Louis Conrad, an assistant district attorney from the neighboring town of Terrence, Texas, who ended up getting caught in the sting. This is where things really fell apart, because the excitement and eagerness to get a catch like this was too much for the crew to handle. The famous Esquire article that goes over this situation, I think, says it best. As Dan Sherrick leaned against the folding table and talked on the phone, a number of perverted justice employees sat at nearby desks, working on computers. At some point after Sherrick hung up the phone, these people ran the screen name and email address and phone number of the man known as Will through a variety of internet search engines. They made certain discoveries, among them Will's real name and occupation. A cameraman recorded a scene shortly thereafter when one of the perverted justice employees informed Chris Hansen. He told Chris Hansen that the man they thought was 19 was actually 56, and his name was Bill Conrad. That he was not a college student, but rather an assistant district attorney of a neighboring county, the county's chief felony prosecutor. In the 2 years since the first episode of To Catch a Predator aired, Chris Hansen had exposed men from a variety of professions: a doctor, a handful of soldiers, a couple of cops, teachers, a rabbi, a minister, but he'd never exposed a prosecutor before. The perverted justice employee rubbed his hands together, clapped them, obviously energized by the news he was imparting. Chris Hansen's usual on-camera listening expression, lips tight, eyes slightly narrowed, just a hint of furrow to his brow, did not change. While this piece is just describing the situations, the action of Chris and the investigative team say a lot more about where their hearts and heads were at this point. In the past, when a potential predator was caught in a sting, but either failed to show up or fled before entering the house, they would still be arrested if the evidence gave enough for the police to work with, and 9 times out of 10, the chat alone is enough to get you convicted. Yet, in this case, the entire situation was different. The motherlode of ratings was here for the taking, and the trophy of a prosecutor's head was just the perfect way to cap off the hunts NBC and PJ had engaged in. So after working with the Murphy police to get a rushed warrant notarized, Chris would leave the sting house, skipping out on all the other potential interviews that could have been conducted to try and get an ambush interview with Conrad during his arrest at his home, only for the cops to enter the house and see Louis Conrad as he pulled the trigger, ending his own life. The fallout of this would end up causing not only a PR nightmare for NBC and the Murphy police, but the absolute worst outcome that could have happened came to be. The entire sting after that point had fallen apart. Due to all the interviews missed from Chris leaving the sting house, the current firestorm happening because of Conrad's death, and thanks to the horrible handling of the entire situation, when it came to trying the men caught in the sting, all of their cases were thrown out and charges would be dropped, because the DA's office declined to take part in the investigation after everything played out. So despite all the evidence and hard work put into the investigation, these men were able to walk away free outside of the infamy that they would face from being on the show, all because of the unprofessional actions of those attempting to catch them. They were essentially free men. And if you think things couldn't get any worse than that, well, NBC would be sued for over $100 million by Louis Conrad's sister. Even though Dateline would take on 2 more episodes after this, once the lawsuit was tied up and finished, the series was ultimately cancelled, and these post-Murphy episodes, while not being as bad, were still produced in a similar style where it was pure entertainment under the guise of bringing justice, essentially being the high-polished TV version of what we now see routinely uploaded to YouTube.
So, when do I get to see myself on TV?
That would be now.
Though at least these predators were real, and their convictions most times ended in jail, at least except for the case of Murphy, but, well, we already know how that ended. Mishandling these sorts of situations can completely tank law enforcement's ability to use evidence or instigate an investigation. And while I can't say for certain, this is more than likely why people like EDP and Christian have been able to relatively get off scot-free themselves, mostly due to the interference and constant intervention of trolls, internet vigilantes, and those who just want to have fun taking a swing at someone. And I'm by no means trying to demonize those who want to do the right thing and catch these monsters, but in the case of people like Predator Poachers and the many other channels who partake in creating these ambush interviews to dunk on, insult, and overall just make content rather than achieve justice, well, they speak for themselves. And when you lump in the stage bullshit like luxury pranks and their many knockoffs, it muddies the water and turns the entire idea into a joke. And I don't think I really need to describe why normalizing and pulling the teeth out of something so dangerous is a bad idea. To tie all this up and get to the point, TCAP went through the very same cycle as what we see today, and in many ways is a cautionary tale of just how bad things can get when you lose sight of the vision you set out with. By no means am I trying to demonize or attack the idea of talking about these issues of child predators, nor am I trying to demonize TCAP. To Catch a Predator is infamous, because despite its shortcomings, it did a lot of good, and it shined a light directly into the underbelly of evil. And through this brought a lot of predators to justice. But when you lose sight of just what's important, and you turn predators and tragedy into content, it can quickly cause far more damage and destruction than you could ever think. As entertaining and funny as it can be, all it really does is devalue the importance of the issues, and in a twisted way normalizes the idea that it's okay to exploit victims and tragic situations if it means clout and currency will come your way. And if the complete failure of the Murphy, Texas sting is anything to go off of, it's that mishandling such an important topic as this could lead to far more harm and even self-destruction, when ratings mean more than justice. But hey, that's just my opinion. I'm sure others will have their own perspectives and thoughts on the matter, so feel free to discuss them with me in the comments. But with all that being said, subscribe, support me on Patreon, follow me on Twitter. I'll see you in the next video.